welcome to the program. Today we're discussing support for Ukrainian servicemen and women returning from the front line in the Donbass that could help of a financial, physiological or legal kind. Many war veterans are calling for the Ukrainian parliament to do more, especially at a time when the law on the reintegration of occupied Donbass is on the table. So what sort of support is there for Ukrainian war veterans and what more needs to be done? Joining us on UATV to discuss this and more is Lesia Vasylenko, founder and chairwoman of the Legal 100 NGO. Thank you for joining us.
Hello.
So your organization provides free legal help to Ukrainian veterans. So as my understanding is, it helps them understand their rights, such as financial law, how to deal with funerals of loved ones, and what social guarantees they're applicable for. How do you evaluate the Ukrainian servicemen needs today, 4 years since the conflict began?
Well, first of all, there has been a significant improvement from what we were dealing with back in 2014 when the war initially started. Because at that point, especially summer 2014, neither the soldiers themselves nor the government bodies were aware about how to apply the provisions of the legislation. Also, the provisions of the legislation, they were generally formulated in the early 90s when Ukraine gained its independence, and then they were reformulated in the 2000s, but mainly dealing with veterans of the armed forces, because Ukraine, being a peaceful country, not having any military conflicts with any of its neighbors, it did not have the need to maintain such a large military.
It wasn't ready, you say?
Yeah, so there was an interest back in the day to diminish the military. Hence, all the social benefits were directed at army veterans to make sure that they could go home and that the army numbers would be decreased. In 2014, the situation was completely opposite to that. The Ukrainian government and the Ministry of the Defense in particular had to think fast about how to get more people on board and into the military units and towards the east, where they would be fighting off the Russian aggression. So a number of laws started appearing, a huge number of laws for that matter. Since 2015, if I'm correct now in saying, over 250 legislative drafts were submitted to the Ukrainian parliament regarding social benefits for the military, for members of their families, and also for veterans who were retiring from the armed forces.
So that's on a legal ground, but I guess most of the Ukrainian veteran artists are not necessarily, well, they don't necessarily know that they have those rights. So that's where, as I understand, your NGOs
where we come in.
Come in.
Exactly. So in 2014, this was a very big issue because the way the organization started was from just a couple of lawyers, myself included, who were volunteering in military hospitals around the country. So what I'd do is I'd go in, bring in some medical supplies, other humanitarian items, and I would talk with the wounded, and I would realize that the main message was that I was fighting for my country, but now the army is not doing anything for me. I'm lying here missing a leg or an arm, and what am I supposed to do? And I started researching legislation because I'm a lawyer by training. I worked in a completely different sphere of law before, but nevertheless. So I started doing my research, and I found out that actually the set of benefits and also the lump sum payments to which these men and women were entitled to were actually quite significant, and you could do something with them. You wouldn't have to collect such huge amounts of money from people willing to help you if you could use this help provided for you by the state. So I started helping them figure out how to do that, actually making applications for these benefits. And then it sort of like grew, the whole process, and more lawyers started joining in. And by 2015, early 2015, we actually registered a non-profit organization, the Legal 100. Юридична сотня, because everything was sotnya or hundreds back then, because we weren't that creative. We didn't have time for marketing purposes, you know, and nobody thought that this would grow into a non-profit organization. It was only about getting as many people in, as many lawyers in, to help these guys put in claims to the government, to the state, to have compensation for their wounds. So that this was the main aim which we were pursuing back in 2014.
So there has been a recent social media initiative launched by prominent figures in Ukrainian veterans, which raises the issue of these veterans' treatment after coming back from the front line. You have an NGO, this is a social media initiative. How would you say, how efficient is that kind of initiative?
Well, it's, in terms of NGO and social media initiative, the two need to coexist. They can't exist without each other, especially in the Ukrainian socium or in Ukraine. The thing is, we also have, our nonprofit organization has also a website, but if you look at the amount of clicks, actually the social media is much more popular, because this is how the information gets distributed. It's much more popular to go online from your mobile devices or from...
And easier. Right?
Yeah, it's much easier. It's also the category of people whom we work with, they are soldiers or they are ex-combatants. And if you're a soldier fighting in the East, you're not exactly going to have a laptop computer. It's easier for you to go on social media, on Facebook, for example, or Telegram. Telegram is now proving to be very useful for these purposes. And what we do is we spread information about the benefits to which they are entitled to by law. Also, we give constant updates about the different legislative acts which are being passed in Parliament, which will affect their rights and their benefits. So we try to keep these 350,000 plus kind of veterans or participants of this war against Russian aggression up to date about the rights and benefits to which they are entitled to.
So that's mostly from your part for the NGO part and for the social part, but so, and as my understanding is like mostly a call to raise awareness among deputies and among officials. How to ensure they answer properly, and do deputies of the Verkhovna Rada or do officials answer properly to that kind of initiative?
Okay, so we advocate a lot. Because we grew into a fully fledged non-profit organization, which doesn't only deal with legal aid, but we also do analytical work. We have a hotline working, so this is our legal aid hotline, but we collect statistics, we collect data from that hotline, and then we use it to identify systemic problems in the legislation. Once our analysis is complete, we go ahead to draft a legislative draft. And then we find friendly members of parliament who are willing to register this as a draft law. And then the advocacy begins. Round tables, press conferences, getting the veterans together to actually petition their local MPs or to petition the President's administration, the Secretariat of the Parliament. Basically, yeah, it's called advocacy. It's a nicer word, you know, because Ukraine doesn't have a law on lobbying. It's not exactly legal, so we call it advocacy. But essentially, it's the same thing.
Okay. So it's coming from the ground and going up to the official now onto the draft bill itself. What are today the main demands of the veteran population?
Okay, so right now the most popular issue with which they come to us is getting land. So Ukrainian legislation provides free land allotments to veterans. So a bylaw has been passed in summer this year, which said that they will be limited in this right. So this is the kind of work that we do. We petition, actually, this is for the Cabinet of Ministers. This is not for the Verkhovna Rada. The Verkhovna Rada right now has 9 draft laws waiting to be passed. They have already gone through committee hearings. So the committees have approved them. This is either the Veteran Affairs Committee of the Parliament or the Defense and Security Committee of the Parliament. So these 9 draft laws which we are talking about, they have been approved. They are ready for to be voted on by the members of parliament. The issue is that they are being put in the agenda, and this has been happening for a number of times throughout 2017, but not a single time were they put out to be voted upon. Sometimes they were, but there were not, enough deputies, enough members of parliament in the actual room to vote on them. So there were not enough votes. So they were put aside and they were postponed and postponed. And these laws, for example, there is a draft law concerning the housing for soldiers and surgeons, because at the moment what happens in the Ukrainian military with housing is that there are military units, but they are not necessarily equipped for the men and women to be living there. So what they do is they rent outside the premises of the military unit. So the officers, under legislation, they have a right to receive compensation for the housing which they rent. The soldiers and the surgeons, they don't have such a right. And what we have is a situation where, on the one hand, the president, the Ministry of Defense, the parliament, government, everyone is saying that, oh, we have raised the salaries for the soldiers. But in reality, okay, there has been a salary raise, but because these soldiers are forced to rent outside the premises of the military unit, it goes back to square one. And it's an issue, it's a very burning issue within the military which needs to be solved. It's the #1 issue for the general staff. It's actually their law which they have drafted. We're only helping to promote it and to advocate for it, but it's proving to be quite difficult.
So why is it important to pass this bill right now? You said it's a pressing matter, but do you think that the law on reintegration of Donbass will help veterans in that case for that kind of draft law to be fulfilled, or is there a risk, again, that this draft law can be drowned?
Well, the draft law you're talking about, it goes under the registration number 7163. It's the most popular draft law for today and actually for the past couple of months for Ukraine. The thing is, it has its own subject matter, and veterans are not part of it. They will be affected because the naming, the title of what's going on in the east of Ukraine, it's going to change. So from a technical perspective, we have the law of Ukraine on veterans and their status. So this law defines what a combat veteran is and defines what kind of benefits combat veterans are entitled to. And right now, this law states that persons or servicemen, servicewomen who have served in the armed forces, in the forces of the Ministry of the Interior, the Border Guard, etc., it lists all the forces of defense and security in Ukraine, and who have taken part in the anti-terrorist operation within the periods and in the territories where it was going on, are entitled to this combat veteran status. The new draft law is going to change this formulation. It's not going to be about the anti-terrorist operation anymore. It's going to be about countering Russian aggression. So we're still not calling it a war, because to call it a war, you need to have a state of war. But we are getting closer to international definitions in international public law, which is important for Ukraine because there are a number of international cases going on in the International Court of Justice, other judiciary bodies, and it is important for Ukraine to have for itself within its territory a definition of what is actually going on in the East, and we need to call things by its proper name. And one of the proper names, and all the facts are evidencing this, is that we have a fact of aggression of one state against the other, and this act of aggression is prohibited by a number of UN resolutions, by the General Assembly of the UN, by the Security Council of the UN, and also by a number of international documents.
So I guess it's an important step, and it will be a hopefully an important step for Ukrainian veterans. Well, thank you for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you in this interview and in our studio. That was Lesia Vasylenko, founder and chairwoman of the Legal 100 NGO. Thank you for watching the program. Stay tuned for the rest.